members washing Joseph Smith's endowment clothes. And she said that she knew the truthfulness of what went on in the endowment just based on the spirit she felt while she was washing his sacred garments and clothes. Hi everybody, welcome to Mix It Up, Black History in the Restoration. I'm Taylor Ricks, and here we mix up a recipe while we mix up the restoration and talk about early Black members of the church. Today we're going to be mixing up some meatloaf, a super simple dish, so that we can talk about Jane Elizabeth Manning James, who is probably one of the most famous African American early pioneers. So I'm so excited to talk about her with you today. All right, so Jane was born in Connecticut in 1822. In Connecticut in 1822, slavery was legal, but it was rare. And so Jane was born into a family that was a free family. She was not born into slavery. However, just because it was a free state doesn't mean African American people were treated well there. And so she spent the majority of her life serving and working as a slave. And at the ripe old age of 6 years old, she was sent to be a servant to the Finch family. And Mr. and Mrs. Finch were old. They were elderly. She didn't say how old. And I will say that almost all of this comes from Jane's personal autobiography. So it's her personal account that you can find on the church history website, which is pretty exciting. So she describes them as old and said that because they were old, their daughter raised her, and she worked there for her entire childhood. During that whole time, she wanted to learn more about God and His gospel, and when she was 14 years old, she was baptized into the Presbyterian church and studied in that church. But she says that she always felt like there was something missing from the Presbyterian church. And so she didn't consider her baptism into that church to be like the end of her search for truth. And so about 18 months after she was baptized, some elders from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints came and started teaching her. And the Presbyterian minister was very upset by this, and he kept warning Jane, and he was like, Jane, don't listen to them, don't do anything that they say. They're a wicked church. But she went to church with the elders on Sunday, and she said she knew right away while she was at church with them that the church was true. And she was baptized 1 week later. So a year after being baptized, the saints were moving to Nauvoo, and they were still in Connecticut, and Eliza wanted to move with her mom. And so she moved with her mom, Eliza. Sorry, her name's Jane. Her mom is Eliza. Her brothers, Isaac, Louis, and Peter, and then her sister, Sarah, and her husband, Anthony, and her sister, Angeline, and her sister-in-law, Lucinda. And I don't know which brother Lucinda was married to. So they all joined the church, and we're gonna hear about some of their stories in future episodes. But they all joined the church and decided they wanted to head towards Nauvoo. So first they got on a ferry, and the ferry got them all the way to Buffalo, New York. And they were under the understanding that they could get all the way to Columbus, Ohio on this ferry, but when they got to Buffalo, before they had to pay additional fare. When they got to Buffalo, the people required more fare from them that they didn't have the means for, and they were kicked off the ferry. So they had to start walking the 800 miles that it would take to get to Nauvoo. She tells a story that while she was walking, all of their shoes wore out completely, and to the point that their feet were bleeding, and they said they left footprints of their entire foot as they walked along. And she told the story that they prayed for their feet to be healed so that they could keep walking, and it was a miracle, and their feet were healed and they were able to keep going. And she said one of the nights they found a light off into the distance. It had gotten completely dark, but they saw this one light, and they followed it to an old cabin, and they were able to sleep there through the night. But every other night on their journey, they had to sleep outside in the cold and in the frost. And she said the frost would settle on them like a heavy snow blanket, and that it was absolutely miserable. So finally, they get to Peoria, Illinois, and when they get there, they run into a police officer who considers them suspicious, and he almost arrests them because he kept asking them for their free papers to prove that they had been freed from slavery. But they were so confused because they had never been slaves. They were born free. At least Jane was born free. And so they, of course, didn't have any papers to give them. And so she says it's by the grace of God that they were set free from that arrest, and they did not spend time in jail, and they were able to move on. So what I love about Jane's story is that, like, there is setback after setback and trial after trial, and the entire time she's like, but God delivered us, everything was good, His hand was in it, we saw how blessed we were. Constantly, she is referring to how blessed they are, and I think that's a humbling example for me in my life, to always look for how blessed I am, even in bleak moments. Finally, they got to La Harpe, Illinois, and they met a sick child there. And she said that they administered to that child and took care of it until it was healthy and able to survive. She said they later learned that the elders in that area had already ministered to that child and believed the child to be too sick to survive, and had decided to stop ministering to the child. And so she said that was just another indication that they were on the Lord's errand. When they finally got to Nauvoo, by the way, La Harpe, Illinois is about 30 miles away from Nauvoo. So when they finally got to Nauvoo, they met Orson Spencer, and he sent them to Joseph Smith. And they called it the Prophet's Mansion, which at the time was also serving as a hotel. So the prophet and his wife and his mom lived there, but it was also serving as a hotel. And so she said that when they arrived, Emma opened the door and said, "Come in, come in." And she sat down with Joseph, and he said, like, "You were probably leading the charge the whole time for her family." And she's like, "Yes, I was." And he asked her about their journey, and they were sitting there with the doctor, and Joseph Smith, she says, turned to the doctor and said, "What do you think about that, doctor? Isn't that faith?" And then he also told her that God will bless you. You are among friends now, and you will be protected. And so she just shares that she absolutely loved the prophet Joseph Smith and his wife Emma instantly because of their warm embrace and welcoming them into the home. The entire family lived there for about 2 or 3 weeks, but then they all found homes except for Jane. And so she was concerned and worried, and she didn't know what to do. She didn't want to be a burden, but she hadn't found a home like the rest of her family members had found. And so she had this conversation with Joseph Smith and Emma, and she wrote it in her autobiography, so I'm going to just read it to you. "Brother Joseph came in every morning to say good morning and ask how we were. During our trip, I had lost all of my clothes. They were all gone. My trunks were set in my canal to the care of Charles Wesley Wendell. One large trunk full of clothes of all descriptions, mostly new. On the morning that my folks all left to go to work, I looked at myself clothed in the only 2 pieces I possessed, and I sat down and wept. Brother Joseph came into the room as usual and said, 'Good morning.' 'Why, not crying, are you?' 'Yes, sir,' I said. 'The folks have all gone and got themselves homes, and I've got none.' He said, 'Yes, you have. You have a home right here if you want it. You mustn't cry. We dry up all tears here.' I said, 'I have lost my trunk and all my clothes.' He asked how I had lost them. I told them I put them in the care of Charles Wesley Wendell and paid him for them, and he had lost them. Brother Joseph said, 'Don't cry. You shall have your trunk again.' Brother Joseph went out and brought Sister Emma, and said, 'Sister Emma, here's a girl that says she has no home. Haven't you a home for her?' 'Why, yes, if she wants one.' He said, 'She does,' and then he left us. Sister Emma said, 'What can you do?' I said, 'I can wash, iron, cook, and do housework.' Then she said, 'When you are rested, you may do the washing if you would just as soon do that.' I said, 'I'm not tired.' 'Well,' she said, 'you may commence your work in the morning.' And she said that was just a good indication of how loving and kind Joseph and Emma were to her during her time living with them. She also said that during that time, endowment sessions were held in the upper room of the building that they lived in while they were building the Nauvoo temple. And she remembers washing Joseph Smith's endowment clothes. And she said that she knew the truthfulness of what went on in the endowment just based on the spirit she felt while she was washing his sacred garments and clothes. Later, she said that Emma offered to adopt her, but she didn't know what adoption meant. So she kind of told Emma, like, think about it a little longer and then ask me again. So Emma gave her a couple weeks and then she asked her again. And she said no, because she didn't understand what that meant. Then the hotel that they were living in, the portion that was hotel, was taken over by somebody else. And so she had to move out and she lived with her mom. At this time, the persecution of the saints was increasing quite a bit in Nauvoo, and she needed some work. So her and her sister went to Joseph Smith and asked if they could go to Burlington to work. And he said, yes, go and be good girls and remember your profession of faith in the everlasting gospel, and the Lord will bless you. They were gone for 3 weeks, and during those 3 weeks, Joseph and Hiram were martyred. She talks about coming back and learning this and being so utterly heartbroken and so devastated at the loss of the prophet. She later moved in with Brigham Young and his wives, and she married Isaac James. And then it was time for the saints to move to Salt Lake, and so Brigham Young left, and soon after, her and her husband followed. They left Nauvoo in 1846, and they went to winter quarters, and they stayed there until spring. And she said her first son, Silas, was born at Keg Creek. They arrived in the Salt Lake Valley September 22nd, 1847, and she said they arrived with very little issues. They did have their cattle stampede at one point, and they didn't find some of them, but she said otherwise they made it without any mishaps. She said 2 of her children were born not in the Salt Lake Valley, and the rest were born in the Salt Lake Valley. So she had Silas, Sylvester, Marianne, Miriam, Ellen, Jesse, Jerry, Bolin, Isaac, and Violet. And she said her husband worked for Brigham Young, and they were very prosperous. They had they had herds and farms, and it was wonderful until the Mormon crickets came, and she said it completely devastated the land. This beautiful landscape that they had worked was completely gone. She said she remembers being so cold that she just couldn't stand it, but the worst part was hearing her children sob and sob and sob because they were so hungry, and she didn't even have a crust of bread to feed them. She later goes on, at the time that she writes her autobiography, she's 80 years old, and she said, I have lived through Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor, Lorenzo Snow, Joseph F. Smith, and I've lived in the Salt Lake Valley for 52 years, and she even had the opportunity to do baptisms for the dead during her lifetime. And she said she knew more than ever that the church was true. And she said at 80 years old, she was blind and a widow, and those were the hardest trials out of everything she'd ever experienced of her entire life, was being blind. But she said she knew from past experiences that the Lord would provide for her. So Elizabeth Manning James is a huge example, a huge pioneer, and an amazing woman. I'm so grateful that we had the opportunity to talk about her today, and we're going to be talking about her posterity throughout the rest of 2021, so I hope you join us again. For the meatloaf, I like to just put a layer of red potatoes in the bottom of my Instant Pot. I'll wrap this in tin foil and set it inside. I cook it for about an hour, hour and a half on high pressure, and then I can either make mashed potatoes or baked potatoes, and we have our main dish, and it's just easy and ready to go. So thanks so much for joining me today. Next week, we will be talking about Green Flake. I talked about him in our last video. He was friends with some different members of the church that we have already talked about. So make sure you come back for next week. Thanks for coming. Bye.